All right, so what we're going to do here with this video is finish off our notes on sort of basic evolution for AP biology. And so if you remember last class, we were in the midst of talking about just sort of putting more detail behind these 5 criteria that must be met for a population to be considered not evolving or at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And as we talked about, this doesn't usually happen, right? This is the development of a null hypothesis, and most of these criteria are not met, and therefore most populations are evolving. So we had already talked a little bit about basically that, natural selection does happen, right? Typically, there is a phenotype that is better at surviving than another. Mutations do happen, right? Just naturally, as we copy our DNA, we express our DNA, we are exposed to environmental conditions that could damage our DNA, mutations occur. And then the third thing we mentioned is that, a lot of times there is mate selection, right? So that mating isn't necessarily random in most populations, but that there is something that organisms are looking for in a mate. Now, this led us to, and we kind of started talking about this idea of genetic drift. And again, genetic drift is the idea that you can get sort of these unexpected changes, really kind of due to chance, right, in allele frequencies, particularly if a population is small. And as we've talked about this year, and you guys have learned for as long as you've been scientists, the less data we have, the more likely it is to be affected by chance. Or the smaller sample size we have, the more likely it is to be affected by chance. So the same is true here for a population, right? The fewer individuals are in the population, the more likely that a chance event is going to be to really affect our gene pool. And as we also mentioned right before we left last class, this one sometimes is actually met because it's hard to get a population huge enough for chance not to really affect it, right? And this goes back to some ecology stuff that we'll talk about soon, but remember, there are limiting factors on population size, things like the amount of food, things like the amount of space. Resources limit the size of a population. So sometimes populations are small and don't get to be really big, like we kind of need for evolution to take place effectively. Now, we mentioned one example from this slide, but now we'll kind of get to this picture as well. The first example I mentioned right before we stopped last time was that, if you have a population and it's only 20 rabbits, and only a couple of those 20 carry a certain allele, well, if a predator knocks out those couple, now we could be in a place where our gene pool is fixed, right? And there's only one allele in that group. Now, here's a little example from our textbook where we have this small meadow with sort of just a handful of snapdragon flowers, right? So we got our reds and our whites and our pinks. And what these white boxes are indicating are that these are the ones that successfully reproduce. So in our first generation, notice they break this down. We've got a P of 0.7, so certainly a more common red allele, and we've got a Q of 0.3. In the next generation, this is really sporadic, right? P and Q become equal at 0.5 because if only these 5 plants reproduce, it's going to change our overall dynamic a little bit. But then check out what happens. In the next generation, only these 2 red flowers reproduce. Now, we've got a fixed gene pool. And once the gene pool is fixed, it's kind of just stuck that way. But again, look at how sporadic the P and Q is. We go from 70%, 30% to 50-50, and then to 100% red. And the reason this can happen is genetic drift. It's because of this small population of flowers that we're observing. Now, another new vocab term, we get a couple of them coming at you here, is a particular sort of variation on genetic drift called the founder effect. And the founder effect is what it sounds like, right? The genes of the founders of a population might give that population an interesting gene pool, right? Because this, presumably small group that comes from these couple of founding members, when we look at their gene pool, there might be an allele that is overrepresented, right? Maybe those members of the group had a rare allele that we wouldn't typically see in that organism or in those people. But because the founders of the group have that rare allele, now a whole bunch of people in that group have that allele. Now, the classic example of this, a couple of human examples that are interesting. The classic example of this is a disease called retinitis pigmentosum, which is a rare disease. As you can guess from the name, it kind of messes with the development of the retina and also the skin. It deals with pigments, right, melanin in your tissues, and so these people are really sensitive to light and have a whole bunch of symptoms that sort of stem from that. But this is really rare. Retinitis pigmentosum we don't see very often, and yet a long time ago. Don't ask me the year. I don't know that history type stuff. But the British colonized a group of islands called the Tristan da Cunha, and of that small group of British colonists who went to those islands to begin with, and quote unquote founded this population, there were actually a couple people who had retinitis pigmentosum. And so then for years, you saw this on these islands, this disease, way more than anywhere else in the world. And it's because the founders of that population had these alleles. Now, I've brought up a couple times Amish individuals. Again, Amish communities have a tendency to sort of isolate, right, stick to themselves, and also then to marry and mate within their own little population. And so we do see more genetic disorders in those groups, in part because they might have a little more genetic similarity to each other, as we've kind of talked about previously. But also what they found in particularly a group that's in Pennsylvania is that the founders of that group many, many years ago probably had a couple of genetic disorders that were pretty rare. And that's dwarfism, right? And polydactyly, meaning having an extra finger or toe, right? And now when we look at the Amish community literally across the United States, we see far higher numbers of dwarfism and polydactyly than we see in any other group in the United States. And when I was in medical school and I did some work outside of Fort Wayne, Indiana, in a town called Grable, Indiana, I talk about this in biomed some, but there's a large Amish community, and one of the very first Amish individuals I saw had extra toes, and it kind of wigged me out a little bit. And the doctor that I worked with, though, talked about this, which I hadn't really learned previously, at least that I remembered in my science classes, that, there are some diseases we see more in the Amish community, and it's because of kind of this concept of the founder effect. And then the last one is probably one of the best studied cases, which is Tay-Sachs disease, which is sort of a issue with neurons that really goes back to an issue with their lysosomes in those cells. Tay-Sachs disease is pretty rare, but it's really common in sort of Hasidic Jewish populations. And so particularly the Ashkenazi Jews who live in the Northeast, kind of in New York State and that kind of area, we see a lot more Tay-Sachs disease than anywhere else. And again, it's because the founders of that group, you had Tay-Sachs disease in one or two of those people. And so now it becomes more common as an allele in the group, which tends to marry within the group and that sort of thing. And so we see higher rates of those traits. Now, one more vocab term is sort of a way that you can get to genetic drift, or a way that you can get to a founder effect type event, and that's called the bottleneck effect, right? And this is a nice little picture. I like this up here that kind of shows you what the bottleneck effect means. But basically what we're saying here is if there's a sudden change in the environment, that can reduce the population size. And so we say that this population that maybe goes from thousands down to 20 individuals has been bottlenecked right? Or it's passed through a bottleneck where it goes from many to just a few. Now realize this is just a way to get the founder effect, right? Because this is just a way to establish our founders of a new population are the ones that survive a change in the environment previously. And so it works out the same way, right? The ones that survive may have alleles that are overrepresented or underrepresented or completely absent compared to the previous population, right? And what we can end up with is a very fixed gene pool, right? A group that kind of lacks genetic variation. Or if we have, again, maybe a rare allele or a disease that survives this change or this impact, maybe that becomes overrepresented in the new population. And the main reason we talk about the bottleneck effect, honestly, is because of the fact that humans are responsible for a lot of bottlenecking, right? When we build a city and we remove a natural habitat, we may very well bottleneck a population. Another good example of a way, this isn't humans' fault necessarily, but another way that we often see bottlenecking is wildfires. All right, so wildfires are not selective, right? If there's a big fire in a forest and a whole bunch of deer are killed by that fire, the ones that survive aren't necessarily the more fit organisms, right? They're just the ones that were in the right place at the right time and didn't fall into this wildfire. So bottlenecking oftentimes leads to a group of founders and can lead to genetic drift because there we're talking about a small group and then their genes become more common in the ensuing population. Now, the fifth and final Hardy-Weinberg criterion was the idea that there can't be gene flow in and out of a population. And this just means immigration and emigration, right? And so, this does commonly happen. Organisms are mobile, right? So we do tend to get this. And when fertile individuals move from one group to another, this can increase variation, right? Or decrease variation, right? Because when the gene pools mix, the two populations sort of combine. And sometimes there becomes such greater similarity between the two that they become one population, right? So we think of, okay, so this new organism comes in, maybe it brings some different genes, but that's usually not the way it works, right? Usually the new individual comes in, it mates with individuals who are already part of that population, that gene pool. And now the subsequent generations are more similar to each other in the grand scheme when we look at the population as a whole. A lot of times this is very beneficial, right? A lot of times this improves the ability of a species to adapt, right? It's in a way, it's similar to crossing over, creating new chromosomes, right? Because we introduce some new alleles maybe to a group or to a population. And so I think it's an interesting study that they've done over the course of the last 50 or so years that when we look at humans as a whole, we actually start to see greater similarity between humans than we used to see because international travel is so much common now, right? We used to see very different regional or country populations, people with different ethnicities, and there was very, again, we're all humans, so there's a lot of genetic similarity, but there was also quite a bit of genetic difference between ourselves and maybe the Chinese culture or African culture or whatever you want to think about on a different place on the globe. But now that modern people tend to travel a lot, it's a lot easier to travel internationally, and it's become a lot more likely to marry or mate outside of your particular small population that you come from. When we look at the greater whole of the human population, we see more genetic similarity because there's a lot more gene flow between different populations of people. Now, the last part of this is a little sort of a combination from a couple different chapters that I call breaking down natural selection, but just adding in some more examples, making sure that some points are clear when we think about Darwin. and natural selection. And, I feel like these terms often are even overused in this first statement here, survival of the fittest and a little less struggle for existence. But these refer to Darwin and his ideas. And, survival of the fittest is taught to little kids, I feel like. And what this is referring to is what we call relative fitness. And so we've already been talking about this. This is not a new thing here at this point. But basically what Darwin says is your fitness, right, how likely you are to survive and reproduce, in a nutshell, is relative to your environment, right? And so that in that particular environment, certain traits lead to greater fitness while other traits might lead to lesser fitness. And so I've begun even where I teach my freshmen a little bit more to not even say fitness, but to say relative fitness, because fitness is always relative to the environment we live in. Now here in this little subpoint, we do have a really official definition of what fitness is. And what you'll notice is that the definition for fitness has been sort of modified to fit our modern understanding better. Right? Fitness is no longer just this likelihood of surviving and reproducing. Now what we say is that fitness is the contribution you make to the gene pool of the next generation. So in other words, fitness or being successful is all about getting your genes into the next generation's gene pool. Right? And so if it's a little more likely that your genes are in that gene pool than another, now we see that you have higher relative fitness, right? And so contrary to what a lot of people think of, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's any kind of fight or competition going on between organisms. It's just that if you have a better set of traits, you have a better phenotype for your environment, you do reproduce and you pass those traits, so you affect the genotypes of the next generation. And any kind of condition in our environment that affects relative fitness is called a selective pressure, right? So things can be selected for or selected against if they are good traits or not so good traits. And we say that the environment is exuding these pressures on the group or on the individual. Now we do have 3 different modes of selection that we think of or that we talk about. And the first one is probably the one that most people think of when they think about what natural selection is. But there's actually 3 ways that it can kind of shake out, right? So the first one is called directional selection. And directional selection, again, is kind of what I think most people think of. And this is where the environment favors or puts pressure on organisms to select one extreme of phenotype. And when we say extreme, we don't mean it's like something crazy. We just mean one particular phenotype versus others, right? And this is really common when you get an environmental change or things like that. So sort of 2 examples here. The first example here in writing just kind of goes with this little picture. And this is one that I teach freshman year. I'm pretty sure Miss Crowdis teaches it as well with her students. The Galapagos finches, right? And we talked about how on a particular island, there might be these large seeds that need to be broken. And so if that's the only food source, now we get these large, big beaks that are able to crack open the seeds. And so all the birds over time trend toward having these large beaks because they're the ones that can eat and survive. And so in this case, fitness or relative fitness prefers or sort of is in the favor of having these large beaks. Now, second example over here on these pictures. All right, let's say that these different types of field mouse live in a field, and they have sort of this bell curve where initially in the original population, it's most common to just sort of be this intermediate phenotype. But if the conditions of the field change for some reason, right, maybe it's a darkening of the environment, well, now we can get what's called directional selection, right? And what we say is this bell just shifts in one direction, right? And it becomes more beneficial to our organism to be one of these darker phenotypes versus the lighter phenotypes. The second mode of selection is called disruptive selection. This is where we disrupt our bell. Basically what happens here is the environment gives us a scenario where individuals at both extremes are favored over the intermediate. So again, let's start actually this time with our mice over here. In disruptive selection, what we would expect is we again start with this original population where the intermediate mouse is favored. But now something happens, I don't know what it would be, but something happens where it is the worst thing to be that intermediate mouse. And so the really lightly colored ones survive better, and the really dark colored ones survive better, and the middle ones just are basically eliminated. This is what we call disruptive selection. A little less common than directional selection, but we can see this happen. And so then another example here in writing with another bird, not in the Galapagos, but in Cameroon, there are these birds, actually multiple species of birds, where they live in an area where you basically either need a really big beak to crack hard seeds, or you need a small beak to handle these tiny seeds. So a medium beak makes it really difficult to eat because you're not quite strong enough to break the big seeds, and you're not quite small enough to handle the small ones. So what you end up seeing is something kind of like the mouse graph, where all of the birds either have a really large beak or a really small beak and nothing in between. The last one is called stabilizing selection. This is a little bit more common than disruptive. And this is where conditions more strongly favor the intermediate. And so over time, we see selective pressure against being either extreme. What this sort of does is sharpens your bell, right? It reduces variation. So again, if we start over here with our mice, again, start out in the original scenario where the intermediate is most common. And something happens in this environment where you basically have to be the intermediate phenotype, or else you get eaten by a predator. So what we see again is this sort of sharpening of the bell, where the bell curve becomes even more centered around that intermediate, that average. All right, and so we see this, there's a few examples in humans about this too. So one of the first pictures we have of Charlotte, and that's with human baby birth weight, right? So we do see extremes in weight. In fact, Mr. Burton weighed about 11 pounds when he was born. He was a big, scary baby. But most human babies, when we look at statistics, fall between about 6.5 and 9 pounds. And what doctors have suggested is that outside of that range, it becomes a little harder to survive after birth, right? If you don't weigh quite enough, you might have a tendency to not survive. If you weigh too much, that might not be a good thing. And so what we've seen over the course of probably hundreds of years, if we had data that we could really look at, is that this bell curve has narrowed, right? To where we've gotten tighter around this average weight for babies that are born. Actually, both of my kids fell within this 6.5 to 9 range. Okay, so the last little thing here, I think, is an interesting topic and one that we will actually come back to later as well, when we kind of get into some ecology type stuff, is the idea of sexual selection. Now, Darwin and certainly others as well talked about sexual selection as sort of a strange exception to the rules of natural selection, right? And sexual selection is kind of what it sounds like, right? Individuals with certain inherited characteristics are more likely to obtain mates, right? So here's the interesting part, and we'll talk about this again on the next slide too. Remember, in natural selection, it's all about survival, right? So the traits that give you better fitness in natural selection are traits that make you more likely to survive. In this scenario, the traits that are selected for are ones that help you secure a mate, right? So we think about like the classic peacock idea. This peacock that's really colorful and has this huge plume of feathers and all that stuff, which, by the way, is the male. If you didn't know that, the male's the pretty one. this obviously is going to stand out to a predator. But if it makes it more likely that this bird is able to mate and get its genes into the gene pool of the next generation, then that's better for that bird, right? And so that's what we talk about when we look at sexual selection. Now, this actually has led to a phenomenon, particularly in the animal world, referred to as sexual dimorphism. And this is sometimes a little bit hard to understand, I think. Sexual dimorphism is differences between the two sexes of a species, right? So we think that sexual selection is what has caused males to look different than females, because males are trying to get a particular look that females will be attracted to. Now, what's sometimes interesting, I think, to people is if you think about humans, right? And I don't want this to make you uncomfortable at all, but if you take away hairdos, if you take away makeup, if you take away clothing, there's actually not a lot of sexual dimorphism between male and female humans, right? Now, we do have those trappings like makeup and hairdos and style and whatever that make girls look different than guys. And so there is that side to it, and that does lend to sexual selection in humans. But in the grand scheme, there's not that much of a difference, right? And then think about like turtles. I don't actually know if my turtles, Marvin and Stevie, are guys or not. It's really hard to determine a male turtle from a female turtle. And that's because they don't have a lot of sexual dimorphism. So what scientists have suggested is that the greater sexual selection pressure there is in a group, the more sexual dimorphism. And so we see sort of the extreme of this is the peacocks, right? There's a lot of sexual dimorphism between them. Females are just kind of boring and gray, while males are bright blue and have this big plume of feathers and all this kind of stuff going on. Think about like lions as well, right? Lions don't look a whole lot different until you consider the mane that males develop. And so then it's kind of easy to tell a mature male from a female lion. Now, sexual selection sort of comes in two forms, right? And that is intrasexual and intersexual. And typically, both of these are going on at the same time, right? So it's not always that way, but usually both intrasexual and intersexual selection will be at play in a population. So the first one, intrasexual, within a sex, right? So this is competition within the same sex. Usually this is males competing, right? So males competing for a female. This might involve an actual fight or competition, right? Depending on the species that we're talking about. But then sort of interlaced with that is the concept of intersexual selection or mate choice, right? In which one sex is choosing their mate from the other sex. Now, what's kind of fun here is usually it's males that are competing intrasexually, and usually it's females who are choosing intersexually, right? And so I put this little thing over here. One of my wife's favorite celebrity type people is Jensen Ackles from Supernatural. So here's a picture of me from our wedding and a really similar picture of Jensen Ackles. I will note both of us substantially younger than we are now. And then a picture of my wife. And so, of course, if we were wild animals and we were there, I would lose. In this scenario. But this would be a scenario where, he and I would compete with each other in some way, and that would be intrasexual. And then my wife would choose which of us she wanted to marry. So that would be intersexual, right? And so then as we kind of said on that last slide, Darwin points out in his book that it's interesting that traits which are good for sexual selection are bad for survival. In the grand scheme, right? Bright colors, showy behaviors like little mating dances and stuff that a lot of birds do. Maybe it's songs that birds sing. These things will attract predators, right? But what Darwin kind of falls back on is just, hey, the benefit must outweigh the risk, right? So the risk of a predator seeing you must be outweighed by the chance that, hey, your bright colors are actually going to find you a better mate, allow you to reproduce, and send kids on into the next generation. Now, there are a couple things we need to talk about at the end here, which are limits to natural selection. A lot of people have suggested before that natural selection should lead to the removal of unfavorable characteristics. And yet, we don't see that, right? Sometimes we do, but not always. We continue to see genetic variation. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? The first one is pretty simple, and that's the fact that we're diploid, right? So recessive alleles don't show up in your phenotype if you're a heterozygote, right? So like if you have a big A, little a genotype, whatever trait that little a codes for is not part of your phenotype. So it sort of can hide from natural selection, right? It doesn't affect the phenotype, but then maybe if we get this genotype in a later generation, that does affect the phenotype in a negative way. But because of heterozygotes, that's maintained, that little a, right? That trait can be maintained. Now we also have something called balancing selection, which is the idea that sometimes in some scenarios, it's good to be the other thing. It's not as simple as we definitely need to be one characteristic, one phenotype, or the other. So the first example of this is called heterozygote advantage. This is where, honestly, it's better to be heterozygous than either homozygote. Right? So what this does is it continues to select for both of those alleles to stay in our population. And the best example of this that we can think of in humans is the sickle cell trait, right? Sickle cell anemia. So remember that if we look at a population, particularly in Africa, where malaria is common, right? Malaria can be a very lethal disease. Well, the sickle cell trait is a recessive trait, right? I'm going to use A's again here. And what we see is that if you are heterozygous for the sickle cell trait, you don't really have sickle cell anemia, and you are immune to malaria. Now, if you are homozygous recessive, you have sickle cell. And if you are homozygous dominant, you don't have sickle cell, but you have a higher risk of malaria. So you don't really want to be the thing that makes you have a high risk of malaria, and you don't really want to be the thing that is sickle cell. And so the highest relative fitness is to be a heterozygote. In other words, there's a heterozygote advantage. And so now, if that's going to be selected for, that's going to keep both of these genes in the population. Now, you come to the United States, there's no malaria to worry about. So it's not good to ever have a sickle cell allele, and so we typically don't see that allele anymore in people of European descent. Now, the second example is one of my favorite examples in nature. I wish we were together to talk about this, but it just didn't work out that way, and that's okay. But this, I think, is just a fascinating example of of natural selection in fitness, right? And we call this frequency-dependent selection. What this means is what it sounds like if you break that down, is that, the relative fitness of a trait depends on how common that trait is. And so it basically, as one thing becomes more common, we can start to see a shift back to the other thing. And then over time, this will continue to happen back and forth. So hopefully you're thinking, how does that happen? Okay, so the great example is a fish called Pericides microlepis, right? And Pericides microlepis is a scale-eating fish. So you see it here, okay? And this Pericides fish eats the scales off of other fish. But here's how this works. I'm going to attempt to draw a picture. I'm sure it's going to turn out poorly, but that's okay. All right, so basically, Parasitus microlepis, we're going to get a little bird's eye view here, okay? Looking down on these fish. So Parasitus microlepis can either be left-mouthed. This is really bad, right? Or they can be right-mouthed. It's actually a twist in the body in that head region that causes their mouth to sort of orient either to the left or to the right. Now what this means is that when they want to bite the scales off of another fish, they have to approach that fish from the correct side, right? So let's say, I draw a bigger fish. This is our prey. All right here. And again, we're above these fish, bird's eye view here. Just so they could have eyes. There we go. So this is my prey. And this would be like the left-hand side of the prey and the right-hand side of the prey, right? So a right-mouthed fish has to attack this prey on its left so that the mouth can actually bite little scales off. Right? And a left-mouthed fish has to bite its prey from the right because the mouth has to be able to grab those scales. Now, what happens is the prey learn. So if most of the parasitus fish that are attacking them are right-mouthed, what the prey does is it learns to watch over its shoulder for these right-mouthed parasitus predators. Well, check out what just happened. When the prey learned to watch over their left shoulder, it just became better to be a left-mouthed parasitus. Because now you can sneak up over here and you can feed. So, what happens? Left-mouthed parasitus become more common. So what did the prey do? They learn to start watching over their right shoulder. And as soon as they learn to watch over their right shoulder, it now becomes better to be right-mouthed again. And so we might even talk about this next time we're together in class just for fun, because I think it's really cool. But essentially, what becomes more common might not be better depending on that prey. And so then we can see this back and forth shift of what is actually higher fitness. All right, now last but not least is that I want you to remember that natural selection does not, and we're even going to say cannot, in most cases, lead to a perfect organism. And that's because selection can only work on what is naturally present, right? So selection can only act on existing variations. You can't just make alleles on demand, right? Allele has to exist in the gene pool for it to be selected for or selected against. So, you're limited by what's already there. Now, we say new forms aren't created from scratch. That's kind of not true, right? New forms are created by mutation, but we can't really predict that, right? So what we often say, and we don't want to, cast negative thoughts on the faith side of things here, but what we often say is there's not a higher power, right? There's not a creative power that's creating the things that we need. So just because a trait would help an organism does not mean it will arise, right? So that's why I put this picture of Samson here in his Superman Halloween costume. A super-powered flying dog would be cool, but that doesn't mean that's going to come to be, right? And a dog that can fly would probably be better at surviving than a dog that can't. But if the flying allele doesn't exist, you're not going to get dogs that fly, right? So you always have to keep that in mind. This is still a very natural process. And here at the bottom, natural selection is at the mercy of chance. And again, as Darwin has taught us, the environment. It all has to do with the environment that you're in. And the last thing we'll point out here too is this third bullet point, realize that an adaptation is pretty much always a compromise. Right, so an adaptation might help you in one way, but it might not help you in another. And that we kind of saw a few minutes ago with sexual selection, right? That, hey, being a bright colored fish might win you mates, but it also might make you a lot more obvious to predators. And so it might make it a little more dangerous to exist in a certain environment as well. So there are some limits to natural selection, right? And it's not a perfect process, and it does rely on chance mutations creating alleles that are better for a population over time. Okay, so I know that was still a lot. Thank you for listening. And this next time we're together, we're going to do some lab stuff, I believe, to get a little break from notes. And then we'll keep on marching through how we apply evolutionary principles to kind of modern biological understanding.